The voicemail came in just after sunset, when the kitchen lights were off and the room felt smaller than it should have. I didn't answer the phone. I already knew who it was. My mother never called to talk anymore. She called to deliver decisions. Her voice played through the speaker, clear and controlled. Christmas is off. Expect a call from my lawyer. That was it. No greeting. No explanation. No pause to let the words soften. Just a sentence designed to end a conversation before it started. I stood there for a moment, phone in my hand, listening to the silence that followed, waiting to see if anything in me reacted. A spike of fear. A rush of anger. Some familiar pull toward fixing whatever crisis she had decided now existed. Nothing came. I didn't call her back. I didn't text. I didn't ask what this was about. I typed one word. Understood. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and opened my laptop. The mortgage portal loaded slowly, like it always did. Same blue header. Same neutral font. The house my parents liked to call the family home sat at the top of the screen. The place they told people they were barely managing to keep. The place I had quietly been helping to carry for years. Balance, $320,000. Borrowers listed, my parents. And me. I clicked through without rushing. Identity verification. Review terms. A small checkbox appeared next to my name. Remove co-borrower. A warning popped up immediately. Removing yourself may trigger a full reassessment of the loan. If the remaining borrowers do not qualify independently, the lender may take appropriate action. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because for the first time, the risk wasn't framed as something I had to absorb. The consequences were clear. They just weren't mine anymore. My hands didn't shake when I clicked submit. The confirmation screen appeared. Neutral. Unemotional. Final. I closed the laptop and stood there in the quiet kitchen, noticing how still everything felt. No adrenaline. No regret. Just a strange sense of balance, like something heavy had finally been set down. 2 days later, my phone almost vibrated itself off the table. Missed calls stacked on the screen. Dozens of them. Messages followed, long and breathless, voices rising with each new voicemail. My mother. My father. Numbers I didn't recognize. Panic layered over itself, urgency trying to disguise fear. I listened to every message once. Not to respond. Just to understand. They weren't calling to ask how I was. They weren't calling to explain anything. They were calling because something they depended on had shifted, and they needed it put back the way it was. One voicemail stood out. A man introducing himself carefully. Their attorney. Polite. Concerned. Very eager to clear up a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding. For the first time in years, the fallout wasn't going to land on me. As the phone finally went quiet again, I thought about how easily my name had ended up on that mortgage in the first place. How normal it had seemed at the time. How responsible. How reasonable. Back then, it didn't feel like control. It felt like helping. And that was the problem. A few months before that voicemail, I was already carrying a weight that didn't belong to me. It didn't arrive with a single dramatic moment. It settled into my life the way humidity settles into Florida air, quietly, constantly, until you stop noticing it's there. I worked my steady job in downtown Tampa, drove home through weather that could flip from sun to rain in minutes, and tried to tell myself my life was normal. But in my family, normal had always meant one thing. If something needed to be handled, it found its way to me. My mom, Brenda, first brought up the mortgage on a day that felt completely ordinary. She didn't sit me down like it was serious. She didn't ask with humility. She brought it up the way people mention errands. "We're just getting squeezed," she said, stirring her iced tea like she was talking about grocery prices. Insurance went up again. Taxes. It's ridiculous. We just need a little breathing room until things stabilize. My dad, Howard, stood behind her in the kitchen, not adding anything. He never did. He had a talent for being present without being responsible. Hands in his pockets, eyes drifting toward the window like the conversation had nothing to do with him. They framed it like I was being included, not recruited. "We're family," my mom said, as if that answered everything. It's not like we're asking you to pay for the whole thing. I wanted to believe her because believing her was easier than asking the questions that would change the relationship. The documents hit my inbox that evening. I remember staring at the screen, seeing my name listed beside theirs, and feeling something shift in my stomach. Not fear. Not outrage. Just that subtle, heavy awareness that something permanent was happening without my consent fully catching up to it. I told myself it was fine. I had stable income. I paid my bills. I didn't have kids. I didn't have chaos. I was, in my mother's words, the one who can handle things. I signed. At first, it looked harmless. I didn't move in. I didn't take over anything. I just became the quiet support beam holding up a structure they insisted was temporary. Then the small emergencies started. It was always something that sounded reasonable when she said it out loud. The air conditioner suddenly failed in the middle of summer. A storm messed up the roof. The HOA fee got higher, can you believe that? The utilities were about to be shut off because a notice slipped through the cracks. Each time, she told the story like she was embarrassed to ask. But she never sounded embarrassed. She sounded entitled to the solution. The first few times I helped, she thanked me. Not warmly. Not deeply. Just enough to check the box. And then the gratitude faded. Not because they didn't need help anymore, but because my help stopped being seen as help. It became part of the system. Something automatic. Something assumed. Like the house itself. My dad stayed quiet through all of it. His contribution was his silence. He'd mutter something about how he hated asking, but he'd let my mom ask anyway. He'd stand nearby while she applied pressure, and then once I agreed, he'd nod like the situation had been handled by a team. It wasn't a team. My older brother, Derek, didn't even pretend to be part of it. He floated above the whole thing, protected by the same unspoken rule he'd always lived under. Derek was allowed to struggle. I was expected to solve. He had opinions, of course. He always did. He'd say things like, "It's not that much," or, "They did a lot for us growing up." Us. Like my money was a group resource. The longer it went on, the more I noticed how my life kept shrinking around their needs. I postponed a weekend trip because the insurance renewal hit harder than expected. I canceled plans because a repair bill couldn't wait. I stopped adding to my savings the way I used to because somehow there was always another gap to fill. And every time I hesitated, the air changed. My mom's voice tightened like I'd failed a test. My dad withdrew like accountability made him tired. My brother went quiet, and his silence carried that familiar edge, disapproval without effort. They didn't say, "You have to." They didn't need to. They had trained me to understand that love in this family was measured in compliance. One night, I sat alone in my apartment with my own unopened mail stacked on the counter, realizing I had stopped thinking about what I wanted entirely. Not because I didn't have dreams. Because I didn't have room. And the part that stayed with me was this. They didn't see my help as sacrifice. They saw it as balance being restored. As if the world naturally tilted toward them, and it was my job to level it. That was when I began to understand the truth I had been avoiding. My name on that mortgage wasn't just paperwork. It was the leash. And they had been holding it so long, they didn't even notice when I started slipping it off. As fall slid quietly toward winter, something in the family rhythm shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No arguments. No announcements. Just small changes in tone that didn't match the words being spoken. Conversations started ending sooner when I joined them. Details blurred where they used to be clear. Plans were mentioned, then quickly smoothed over, like they hadn't meant to surface at all. My mom started using phrases instead of specifics. "We're still figuring things out. It depends on how everything lines up. We'll see how December looks." Each sentence landed softly, but together they formed a distance I couldn't ignore. At first, I assumed it was stress. Holidays always tighten things. Travel costs. Scheduling. The usual friction families pretend not to feel. I didn't press. Pressing had never worked in my favor anyway. Then I noticed what wasn't being said. No one asked about my time off. No one mentioned where I'd be staying. No one talked about plans that included the word "we." It was subtle enough that I could have convinced myself it meant nothing. That they were just disorganized. That something would be clarified later. But clarity never came. Instead, my brother Derek started acting different. Lighter. Energized. He posted vague updates online about needing a reset, about finally getting away for a bit. Nothing concrete. Just enough to suggest anticipation. That was when the discomfort settled in. Derek never planned anything unless it was already paid for. I didn't confront anyone. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I was tired of chasing explanations that always made me feel unreasonable for asking. The confirmation arrived quietly, the way most truths do when they've been hiding in plain sight. I was reviewing my bank activity one evening, doing what I'd learned to do over the years, checking for inconsistencies before they became emergencies. A small charge caught my eye. Easy to miss. Buried between ordinary expenses. It wasn't medical, even though it had been labeled that way. The merchant name didn't match anything familiar. A quick search pulled it up immediately. A coastal resort in the Florida Keys. Holiday package. Limited availability. The amount matched a deposit. I sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the screen, letting the implication settle without rushing to defend it. They hadn't forgotten to tell me. They had chosen not to. I had paid toward something designed to happen without me. What struck me wasn't the cost. I could have absorbed that without difficulty. I'd absorbed far worse under the banner of family support. It was the efficiency of the exclusion. They had organized schedules, coordinated logistics, and committed funds, all without once considering whether I would be part of it. Not because there wasn't room. Because there was no need. My role didn't require presence. It required contribution. I replayed the last few weeks in my mind with this new lens, and suddenly everything lined up. The careful vagueness. The shortened conversations. The way my mom's tone shifted when I mentioned December. The way Derek stopped asking if I had holiday plans altogether. They had already built the version of the holiday they wanted. One where I remained useful, but invisible. And the most unsettling part wasn't the realization itself. It was how unsurprising it felt once I saw it. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have implied betrayal. This was older than that. Deeper. It was the understanding that my value had been quietly reassigned without discussion. I wasn't part of the celebration. I was part of the infrastructure. I closed the banking app and sat there in the quiet, letting the truth land fully instead of rushing past it like I usually did. For the first time, I didn't look for a way to explain it away. I didn't reach for empathy on their behalf. I let the reality exist as it was. They had created joy that functioned best without me. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction everything else would take. Because once you see where you're not wanted, it becomes impossible to keep pretending you belong. And without realizing it, I had crossed the point where silence stopped protecting them and started protecting me. The distance didn't stay private for long. It leaked into places I couldn't control, carried by a version of events I hadn't agreed to but was expected to live with anyway. The first sign showed up on my phone one morning while I was getting ready for work. A post from my mom, Brenda. Carefully written. Softly worded. Just vague enough to sound noble. She wrote about sacrifice. About exhaustion. About how hard it is to love children who forget who stood by them when things were hard. She never used my name. She didn't have to. The comments filled in the rest. People offering sympathy. Praising her strength. Nodding along to a story that required a villain but never bothered to identify one directly. I recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't about clarity. It was about control. She followed it with another post a few days later. Gratitude mixed with grief. The burden of parenting. The loneliness of carrying everything alone. Each line crafted to invite validation without accountability. My dad, Howard, reacted the way he always did. Quiet approval. A like here. A heart there. He never challenged her publicly. He never clarified anything. His silence gave her story weight. My brother Derek added his own contribution. Something about loyalty. About family sticking together. Short. Ambiguous. Enough to signal which side he was on without saying anything concrete. And, just like that, the narrative took shape. I watched acquaintances share her posts. Neighbors comment. Members of her church group step in with words of encouragement. None of them asked questions. None of them considered there might be another side. They didn't need to. She had already given them a story that felt complete. What surprised me wasn't how quickly people believed her. It was how familiar it felt. I had been cast in that role my entire life. The one who withholds. The one who disappoints. The one whose boundaries are framed as cruelty. Seeing it play out publicly just stripped away the last illusion that this dynamic was ever going to change. The distance didn't stay private for long. It leaked into places I couldn't control, carried by a version of events I hadn't agreed to but was expected to live with anyway. The first sign showed up on my phone one morning while I was getting ready for work. A post from my mom, Brenda. Carefully written. Softly worded. Just vague enough to sound noble. She wrote about sacrifice. About exhaustion. About how hard it is to love children who forget who stood by them when things were hard. She never used my name. She didn't have to. The comments filled in the rest. People offering sympathy. Praising her strength. Nodding along to a story that required a villain but never bothered to identify one directly. I recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't about clarity. It was about control. She followed it with another post a few days later. Gratitude mixed with grief. The burden of parenting. The loneliness of carrying everything alone. Each line crafted to invite validation without accountability. My dad, Howard, reacted the way he always did. Quiet approval. A like here. A heart there. He never challenged her publicly. He never clarified anything. His silence gave her story weight. My brother Derek added his own contribution. Something about loyalty. About family sticking together. Short. Ambiguous. Enough to signal which side he was on without saying anything concrete. And, just like that, the narrative took shape. I watched acquaintances share her posts. Neighbors comment. Members of her church group step in with words of encouragement. None of them asked questions. None of them considered there might be another side. They didn't need to. She had already given them a story that felt complete. What surprised me wasn't how quickly people believed her. It was how familiar it felt. I had been cast in that role my entire life. The one who withholds. The one who disappoints. The one whose boundaries are framed as cruelty. Seeing it play out publicly just stripped away the last illusion that this dynamic was ever going to change. I didn't respond. Not online. Not privately. Not at all. Instead, I started doing something I'd never done before. I documented. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of necessity. I opened a folder on my laptop and began pulling together records I'd ignored for years. Bank transfers. Payment confirmations. Messages asking for help that never came with repayment. Notes I'd saved about due dates that weren't mine. Each file felt strangely neutral as I added it. There was no emotional surge. No sense of vindication. Just clarity. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped pretending they were isolated incidents. The requests always arrived right before deadlines. The gratitude always faded fast. The promises of next time never materialized. I found voice messages filled with urgency that now sounded rehearsed. Emails that framed financial support as temporary while extending it indefinitely. Texts that assumed my availability without asking. Seeing it all laid out like that changed something in me. This wasn't miscommunication. It was a system. And I had been the quiet mechanism keeping it running. The posts my mother shared weren't misunderstandings. They were insurance. A way to secure sympathy in advance. A way to position herself as the one being wronged, just in case the story ever shifted. And it had shifted. I could feel it. The more I documented, the less defensive I felt. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else. I was anchoring myself to facts so I wouldn't be pulled back into doubt when pressure inevitably came. Because pressure always came. This time, I was ready for it. By the end of the week, my folder was full. Years of quiet compliance captured in dates and numbers. Evidence that didn't accuse, didn't dramatize, didn't exaggerate. It just existed. And for the first time, I realized something important. I didn't need to correct the story they were telling about me. I needed to stop living inside it. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with resolve. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits patiently until the moment arrives where action becomes inevitable. That moment, it turned out, was already on its way. And when it arrived, it wouldn't ask for permission. The shift didn't announce itself with clarity or apology. It arrived the way pressure always does in my family, loud, insistent, and suddenly urgent once something stopped working the way they expected. My phone started vibrating early in the morning, before I had even finished my coffee. One missed call turned into 5. 5 turned into 12. By the time I checked the screen, there were dozens stacked on top of each other, each one more frantic than the last. I didn't answer any of them. I let the calls ring out while I sat at the table, watching the notifications pile up. Text messages followed quickly. Short at first, then longer, then scattered, emotional, and increasingly panicked. My mom's messages jumped between accusation and concern. Why aren't you answering? This isn't funny. We need to talk. Now. My dad left a voicemail that sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced saying the right words without fully understanding them. There's been some confusion, he said carefully. We just want to clear things up. Clear things up. That phrase had always meant one thing. Put everything back where it was. Restore the balance. Return the burden quietly to me. I listened to the messages once, then put the phone back down. The calm I felt surprised me. Not because I expected to panic, but because I realized how familiar this cycle was. They never reached out when things were stable. They reached out when something slipped out of their control. Late that afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail like the rest. The message was different. Polished. Controlled. Delivered by someone who spoke for a living. He introduced himself as their attorney. His tone was courteous, almost friendly. He mentioned misunderstandings. He suggested we connect soon to prevent unnecessary complications. The wording was careful, but the intention wasn't. This wasn't about concern. It was about containment. Hearing his voice clarified something that had already been forming quietly in my mind. They hadn't tried to talk to me first. They hadn't asked why I did what I did. They went straight to leverage. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't upset about losing me. They were upset about losing access. I sat there listening to the voicemail again, not because I needed to, but because it confirmed what I had documented so carefully. Their relationship with me had always been transactional. The moment the transaction stopped benefiting them, the tone shifted. Urgency replaced entitlement. Pressure replaced assumption. And still, not one of them asked how I was. Not one of them apologized. Not one of them acknowledged the imbalance I had been carrying for years. They only wanted the system restored. That was when I understood the voicemail from my mother for what it really was. It wasn't a punishment. It was a test. A declaration meant to pull me back into line. They never expected me to accept it. They expected me to panic. I didn't. I finished my coffee. I cleaned the mug. I went about my day like someone who had already made peace with the outcome. The calls kept coming into the evening. Some angry. Some pleading. Some pretending nothing was wrong except my silence. I didn't respond to any of them. Because silence was the only language they hadn't prepared for. By the time the phone finally went quiet, I knew what would come next. There would be a meeting. There always was. A controlled environment where they believed they could reassert authority, explain things away, and remind me of my place. What they didn't realize was that the place they remembered no longer existed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't defensive. I was finished. And when I agreed to meet them, it wasn't to negotiate. It was to end something they had assumed would last forever. I chose the location carefully. Not our house. Not a place tied to birthdays or holidays or forced memories. Just a small diner off the highway where no one knew us and nothing about the room carried emotional weight. Neutral ground. I arrived early and took a booth by the window. The vinyl seat was cracked from years of use, the table slightly uneven. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Exactly what I needed. There was no dramatic build-up inside me, no rehearsed speech looping in my head. I wasn't preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to observe. For most of my life, every interaction with my family required vigilance. Reading tone. Anticipating reactions. Adjusting myself before they could decide who I needed to be. Sitting there, waiting for them to arrive, I noticed how absent that reflex felt. I wasn't bracing anymore. The door opened and they walked in together, just like they always did. My mom, Brenda, scanning the room first, already calculating. My dad, Howard, a step behind her, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. My brother Derek trailing slightly, carrying a confidence that didn't quite hold. They slid into the booth across from me, their movements stiff, their expressions layered with frustration they were trying to disguise as concern. Brenda spoke first. She always did. "What is going on with you?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I noticed what she didn't ask. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I had done to them. I didn't answer right away. Not to punish her. Just because I didn't feel the need to rush anymore. The silence stretched slightly, and I could see it unsettled her. Silence always did. My dad leaned forward next. "This didn't need to get this far," he said. "We could have handled this as a family." Handled it. The word landed exactly how it always had. As code for quietly undoing whatever boundary I had tried to set. Derek crossed his arms. "You didn't have to make it this extreme," he added. "People are asking questions." There it was. Not concern. Exposure. I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. They were following the script they'd always used. Minimize. Redirect. Pressure. Guilt. The difference was that I wasn't playing my part. "I understand this is uncomfortable," I said evenly. "But it isn't sudden." Brenda's expression tightened. "You blindsided us." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I wasn't searching for approval or permission in her face. "I didn't," I said. "I stopped absorbing consequences that weren't mine." That landed harder than anything emotional could have. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. My dad shifted in his seat. Derek looked away, suddenly interested in the menu behind me. I reached into my bag and placed a thin folder on the table. I didn't slide it toward them. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. "I kept records," I said simply. Not to argue. Not to threaten. Just so I wouldn't forget what actually happened. The presence of that folder changed the energy instantly. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was accountability, and none of them had prepared for it. Before anyone could respond, the door opened again. My grandfather, Thomas Lane, walked in without urgency, his movements steady, deliberate. He spotted us immediately and came over without asking. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't need to. He sat down beside me. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. Not tense, but final. Brenda's posture shifted. My dad went still. Derek straightened, like a child suddenly aware of being watched by someone who couldn't be manipulated. My grandfather didn't look at me. He looked at them. "I've been watching this pattern for a long time," he said calmly. "Longer than any of you realize." No accusation. No raised voice. Just truth, delivered without decoration. "I didn't come to fix anything," he continued. "I came to make sure it doesn't get rewritten." No one argued. They couldn't. Because for the first time, I wasn't alone in the room holding reality together. I didn't feel rescued. I felt witnessed. And that was enough. When we stood to leave, there were no apologies. No resolutions. Just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The system they depended on had stopped working. And they finally knew it wasn't coming back. The days after that meeting were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful. Just quiet in the way things become when there's nothing left to argue about. My phone stayed mostly still. No frantic messages. No attempts to explain. No more pressure disguised as concern. They didn't apologize. They didn't try to repair anything. They withdrew. At first, that absence felt unfamiliar. For so long, my life had been shaped around anticipating their needs that the sudden lack of them felt like standing in a room after a loud machine shuts off. The silence rang, but it wasn't painful. It was revealing. The mortgage reassessment moved forward without me. Notices arrived that I never opened because they weren't addressed to me anymore. For years, I had absorbed problems before they could fully exist. Now, those problems had nowhere to go. That wasn't punishment. That was reality. I heard fragments of what happened next through people who didn't realize how much weight their words carried. My parents scrambling to explain finances they'd never fully managed. Deadlines they couldn't meet. Conversations they couldn't redirect. The stability they believed was permanent unraveling under scrutiny. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing any of it. What I felt was distance. The kind that lets you see a pattern clearly for the first time. My brother Derek stopped posting online. The confidence that once came so easily to him faded when the structure supporting it cracked. Without the family narrative protecting him, he was suddenly responsible for himself in ways he never had been. That, too, wasn't my burden to carry. One evening, my grandfather came by quietly, like he always did. He didn't ask for updates. He didn't offer advice. We sat at my kitchen table, drinking tea, letting the moment exist without needing to fill it. "You did the right thing," he said finally. Not as reassurance. As fact. That was all. After he left, I started untangling my life from theirs in small, deliberate ways. I removed shared accounts. Changed emergency contacts. Cleaned out old messages that kept me anchored to obligations that no longer existed. None of it felt dramatic. It felt necessary. Cutting ties didn't erase the years I spent being useful instead of valued. It didn't undo the moments where I mistook responsibility for love. But it created space. Space to notice how much energy I had been spending just to keep things from collapsing. I thought about all the times I had convinced myself that endurance was loyalty. That silence was maturity. That self-sacrifice was proof of love. It wasn't. It was training. And once I stepped out of it, I could see how thoroughly it had shaped me. Walking away didn't make me cruel. It didn't make me ungrateful. It didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. Honest about what I could carry and what I never should have been asked to. This story isn't about revenge. I didn't win anything. I didn't take something from them. I stopped giving what was costing me my life. There's a difference. Sometimes the people who claim to love you rely on your silence more than your presence. Sometimes they call it family because it sounds better than dependency. And sometimes the most radical act of self-respect is refusing to continue playing a role that was written to exhaust you. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You don't owe access to people who only value what you provide. You don't have to keep setting yourself on fire to keep a family warm. And you're allowed, fully allowed, to choose yourself without explaining why. For the first time, I didn't fix anything. I let it stand. And in doing that, I finally did something I'd never been allowed to do before. I kept my life.